I've been uploading videos on YouTube for about 2 years now, and most of them are about the Beatles. There's many reasons to this. I mean, they're by far the most popular band of all time. They release some of the most loved and critically acclaimed albums ever. And then there's also the fact that they have one of the most well-documented careers in the history of music. So there's a lot of material to talk about, there's a lot of stories, and there's a lot of myths surrounding the band. But by far, the main reason is simply that the Beatles are my favorite band of all time, so I love talking about them. And I think it shows every time I do a video on them, because the comment section is filled with people that also love the Beatles and that have wonderful stories to tell. Some of you were around in the 60s when the Beatles were active. Some of you were around in the 70s and 80s and tell me stories about your parents and how they loved the Beatles. Some of you are even around my age and were born in the new era of music, but still hear stories about the Beatles and their legacy and how influential they were. However, even though everyone in the world knows and loves the Beatles, there's always that one guy in the comments. There's always that one guy that wants to make sure everyone knows that he's not like the others. He's unique. He's special because he doesn't like the Beatles, and his life mission is for everyone to know that he is different from the rest. I usually love any type of comment you may leave in one of my videos. If you disagree with me, if you think the Beatles are not a great band, if you think they're the most overrated band ever, as long as you have an actual argument, as long as you take the time to write your reasons why you think that's the case, then that's perfectly fine. I actually love when people do things like that because I can actually have a conversation with them and it's really interesting and insightful. But usually this type of people only leave provocative comments like the Beatles are the most overrated band of all time. Paul McCartney died in 1966, so the Beatles are not even the Beatles, and stupid shit like that that barely even counts as an opinion because you're not really explaining why you feel that way. But I do have to give these people some credit because usually when I find those type of comments, there's already a bunch of replies of people telling him things that are not exactly that nice. Even some people saying that he should terminate his breathing activities for an indefinite amount of time.
Dude, I almost had you.
The hate they usually get literally made me question the Beatles and their legacy, because I thought to myself, who would go out of their way to put themselves in the way of all this hate if they don't actually think the band is overrated? So today, we have an overrated episode on the Beatles. I've never done it before, which surprises me. If you guys don't know and you don't follow the channel, first of all, what are you doing? Go ahead and subscribe. And number two, this is a series where we take 4 different categories: popularity, influence, performance, and discography, and based on the results in each category, we decide whether or not the band, the artist, or the group is overrated at the very end of the video. Of course, this is only going to be based on my own personal opinion, so if you disagree, and I'm pretty sure you will, go ahead and leave it down below in the comments and I'll make sure to read it, give you my opinion on your opinion, and we can have a conversation in the comment section. I really don't want this video to be that long. I don't want to bore you with a long intro, so let's just go with the first category.
Now, our host for this evening, the Bony Rolls.
This is probably going to be the easiest category. I've in my 23 years of living, I've never met a single person who believes that the Beatles are overrated in terms of popularity. The Beatles are the most popular band of all time. Actually, John Lennon and Paul McCartney are known to be some of the most popular human beings to ever exist. And I'm not exaggerating when I say this, by the way. The only 2 artists that come close to the level of popularity the Beatles enjoyed in the 60s and the 70s are Michael Jackson and Elvis Presley. No one else. And even them were not as popular as the Beatles and as John Lennon and Paul McCartney were. Of course, a lot of people claim that Michael Jackson had another level of fame, like he was constantly on the news all the time. And it's true, you know, I do agree with that, but we also have to understand the fact that he was around in the 80s and the 90s where technology, tabloids, TV was way more developed, so obviously you were going to see him on the news more often. The Beatles, on the other hand, were around in the 60s. There wasn't that much technology. Plus, even though you already had some global stars to come out of the music scene, for example, Elvis Presley or Frank Sinatra, none of them were quite like the Beatles. From the moment they did the Ed Sullivan Show in 1964, they stayed on the news up until they broke up in 1970. And even after they broke up, they stayed on the news, this time as solo artists. So even though Michael Jackson and Elvis Presley were incredibly popular too, they were not bigger than the Beatles in the 60s. The Beatles and Beatlemania are the most popular music phenomenon in the history of music. and that's a fact. Actually, I would go as far as to say that the reasons why they got in so much trouble for saying that they were bigger than Jesus in 1966 is because Christians felt like he actually had a point. They looked at the fame and influence of the Beatles and they said maybe this is an actual threat. They actually seemed to be more popular than Christianity itself, so they went on to sabotage the band by burning albums, spreading a bunch of lies, and boycotting concerts, and so on and so forth. That's a topic for another day. If you want even more proof that the Beatles are in fact not overrated, you can also look at the fact that in the top 100 best-selling albums of all time in the history of music, the Beatles have 4 albums: the White Album, the One compilation, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and Abbey Road. I mean, even when they release like new mixes and new remasters of old albums like Revolver, Rubber Soul, or Abbey Road, they chart and they go really close to number 1. So if that's not enough to convince you that the Beatles are not overrated in terms of popularity, I don't know what will.
And now your hosts for this evening, the Rolling Stones.
This category is going to be way more interesting. With the previous one, I think we all knew that they weren't going to be overrated. With this one, it's going to be a little bit more complicated because there's a lot of things to consider. First and most importantly, the fact that the Beatles are known to be the most influential band of all time. And I agree with that, but when you get specific and you start naming genres, that's when people usually get it wrong. For example, if you were to ask me, are the Beatles the most influential rock band of all time? I would say no. In my opinion, bands like Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, and many other bands from the 60s were more influential in the way that rock music was developed in the 70s. When you ask me, are the Beatles the most influential pop band of all time? In my opinion, bands like the Beach Boys, for example, with Brian Wilson's arrangements, were more influential for pop music than the Beatles. If you ask me, do you think the Beatles were the most influential metal band of all time because they were one of the first to use a similar sound with songs like I Want You See So Heavy, Helter Skelter, and Your Blues? I would say no. In my opinion, Led Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix, the Kings, and a multitude of other bands in the 60s also had a lot to say when it comes to contributions to the metal music genre. And that's how it goes for most genres the Beatles participated in. So why is it that people say that the Beatles are the most influential band of all time when, there's bands in specific genres that had more influence overall? Well, the thing is that it's not that the Beatles had the most amount of influence in one specific part of music. It's the fact that they had a lot of influence in many genres of music, okay? So even though they weren't as influential as Led Zeppelin in terms of rock music, Led Zeppelin has little to no influence in genres like folk music and pop music. The Beach Boys are more influential than the Beatles in pop music, that's true, but the Beach Boys have little to no influence in genres like heavy metal music and progressive rock, and the Beatles do. In other words, the Beatles have a lot of influence in a multitude of genres, and that's the reason why they're often called the most influential band. There's other reasons too: the cover of Sgt. Pepper's, the release of that album, changing the way that music was perceived by the media. Then there's also the fact that music videos were basically introduced by the Beatles. They were pioneers in the idea of a concept album, with a certain narrative being carried through the whole track list. There's a lot of things that I can say that makes the Beatles the most influential band of all time. But for now, you have to understand that when you look at metal music, when you look at pop music, when you look at rock music, punk music, progressive rock, alternative rock, all of those genres owe something to the Beatles, and that's more than any other artist can say. So if you think that Pink Floyd was way more influential than the Beatles, then go ahead and listen to what Roger Waters has to say about that.
When they made Sgt. Pepper in '67, we were in the same studio making our first record, and I remember when it came out, pulling the Zephyr 4 over into a lay-by and listening to the whole thing and just sitting there with my mouth hanging open going, wow, this is so complete and accomplished and whatever. But it also was more than that. It had a ton of ideas and a ton of narrative in it, and I feel more than any other record, it was the record that gave me and my generation permission to branch out and do whatever we wanted. But if they can do it, we can do it.
Oh, you think that Brian Wilson and his arrangements with the Beach Boys and albums like Pet Sounds were way more important? Then let's see what Brian Wilson has to say about that.
Oh, I was so jealous. I was jealous of the Beatles. I couldn't believe how jealous I was of the Beatles. I couldn't believe it. I was so jealous. And here they are. Here they are from England, from London, England. The Beatles! I want to hold your hand, and everything. Oh, I just couldn't believe it.
Oh, you think that the Rolling Stones were way more influential than the Beatles? Let's see what Mick Jagger has to say.
I mean, they were also showing the way because they were the first of this kind of...
So you kind of admired them?
You admired them for that because they were sort of trailblazers in a lot of ways. Because in England, most English people were never really been stars outside of England. It would be that you had your little patch and that was it. And the Beatles kind of showed that you could be big internationally.
What was that? You think that the metal genre has nothing to do with the Beatles? Let's see what Ozzy Osbourne has to say about that.
So going to bed in a black and white world and waking up and it turned to colour. That's exactly what it felt like. We come out of World War II and the fucking rationing and the whole thing. And it was like we had strict rules to live by. And that broke the fucking doors down for so many people and give freedom to the world.
There's no way in hell that anyone with enough knowledge about music will say that the Beatles are not the most influential band of all time. So in terms of influence, the Beatles are in fact not overrated.
And now your hosts for this evening, the Rolling Stones.
Alright, so for this category, I need to get comfortable in my chair because I'm about to say some things that you're not gonna like. In terms of performance, are the Beatles overrated? 100%. It's really hard for me to say that because I love Paul McCartney. In my opinion, he's one of the greatest performers of all time. But we're talking about the Beatles as a group here, and it's true that their chemistry as a band wasn't that great. Their chemistry as a songwriting force, their chemistry as a creative powerhouse was impressive. But when it comes to actually performing the songs, they weren't exactly the greatest. And I think that's the reason why I always find myself listening to all these deluxe editions and archive collections and box sets of their new remasters and mix of the songs, because they have this takes and all these demos that were never really released and never made public. And when you listen to them, you kind of understand why they were really clumsy when it comes to, performing the tracks. And they had the song ready. They knew what they were supposed to do. But in terms of vocals, in terms of, tempo, they were kind of, and I don't even know how to say this. Let's just say they weren't the best. In some of the live performances, especially the ones from 1964, they did a really good job and they were a really good band, but prior to that and after that, it's kind of rough. And by the way, I don't believe that the reason why this happened was because they don't know how to play their instruments. I think it all comes down to chemistry and, the fact that they didn't really know how to improvise. And I'm by no means agreeing with the comments of an idiot like Quincy Jones, who claims that the Beatles are the worst band of all time and that Ringo was a terrible drummer. But once again, when you look at the live performances and when you look at some of the takes, you do realize that they had a hard time performing these songs as a live band. Dude, even in their most popular live performance, the one in 1969 in the Rooftop, there's quite a few mistakes, especially when it comes to John Lennon. So when you look at that, and when you look at some of the demos and the tapes, and I know that a lot of you will say, oh, their tapes are not supposed to sound good because they didn't get the song right. Okay, I get it, but it was still a take. They tried to record the song and they didn't do it properly. And listen, I know that individually they're incredible. John and Paul are some of the most influential singers of all time. George is an incredible guitarist and a great singer too. And Ringo is one of the greatest drummers to ever exist. But as a band, as the Beatles, they had a lot of chemistry problems. And that's the reason why usually, it took them a lot of takes to nail the song properly. That's the reason why, in terms of performance, I do believe that the Beatles are a little bit overrated.
And now your hosts for this evening, the Rolling Stones.
This is by far the most important category because this is the actual albums, the actual songs they put out as the Beatles. So if they're not overrated in this category, they're most likely not overrated at all. So before I start talking about the greatness of the Beatles and their discography, let me remind you the albums they released in only 7 years. Please Please Me, With the Beatles, A Hard Day's Night, Beatles for Sale, Help, Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Magical Mystery Tour, The White Album, Yellow Submarine, Abbey Road, and Let It Be. At least 5 of those 13 albums I just named belong in a top 20 list of the greatest albums of all time, and I'm not exaggerating. Albums like Revolver, Rubber Soul, Sgt. Pepper's, Abbey Road, and The White Album, in my opinion, are the greatest musical statements to ever be released by a band, group, or artist. And by the way, you can find a multitude of genres in those albums that go from Baroque, folk music, pop music, rock, psychedelic rock, heavy rock, metal music, progressive rock, and the list goes on. Like the amount of genres, sounds, songwriting styles, performance styles that are found in those albums is ridiculously large, and that is one of the main reasons why the Beatles and their discography are some of the most entertaining things you can do with a speaker. And I know that I already said it, but I cannot stress enough that the Beatles released all of these music in only 7 years, and as solo artists they went on to release even more or music that was incredibly influential too, like All Things Must Pass by George Harrison, Plastic Ono Band by John Lennon, and Ram by Paul McCartney. There's multiple music magazines that have made lists of the greatest albums of all time, and almost every single release by the band is found in those lists, with the only exception being Beatles for Sale, which is basically the band trying to replicate their live act on an album, and Yellow Submarine, and that's not even a Beatles album. You know, half of it is a bunch of compositions made by George Martin for the soundtrack of the Yellow Submarine film, and then the other half is a bunch of singles previously released by the Beatles. When you look at the actual albums that were conceived by the Beatles and not as a marketing stunt, every single one of them is a masterpiece and was released in only 7 years. That is one of the most impressive feats in the history of music, actually. I would go as far as to say that it's the most impressive one, because in only 7 years, the Beatles crafted the greatest discography of all time. There's multiple other artists like Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Queen, Bob Dylan, David Bowie that have released a similar amount of great music. However, they had a lot more time to do so. 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, you know, Bob Dylan has like 49 studio albums. David Bowie has like 30. You know, they had a lot more time to develop their music. You know, they had a lot of albums that are terrible. You know, instead the Beatles, even if you want to include Yellow Submarine in the mix, it's not even a bad album. It just feels kind of weird because it feels so disconnected from the rest of the band's discography. But apart from that, it's a really enjoyable record. Every single album by the band is incredibly enjoyable, incredibly important. And for that reason, in terms of discography, there's not a single person in the planet that can tell you that the Beatles are overrated. The conclusion is pretty much obvious here. I think that the only reasonable argument people have against the Beatles is the fact that as a band, they weren't exactly the greatest performers, at least not as many people say they were. But apart from performance, when it comes to popularity, when it comes to influence, and most importantly, when it comes to discography, the Beatles are not overrated. Therefore, the band is not overrated, and anyone who says so simply doesn't know what they're talking about. And that is going to be it for today's video. I really hope that you guys enjoyed it. If you did, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. If you want me to talk about any other topic related to music, if you want me to check out a song, an album, or an artist, leave it down below as well, and I'll make sure to read it and fulfill your request as soon as I can. Once again, I hope that you guys enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you soon with a new video. But until then, bye.